This is episode 179. I'm Tommy Serafinski, and you're listening to Conservation and Science podcast, where we take a deep dive into topics of ecology, conservation, and human-wildlife interactions. And today's topic, Sika deer, and more specifically, the European Commission's move to list Sika deer or put Sika deer onto invasive alien species list of union concern, and more specifically, what does it mean to Ireland? Well, in case you don't know, Sika deer was introduced to Ireland in 1860, and then they promptly did what deer do. They jumped the fence and they escaped, start breeding and spreading, and right now we have a significant population of Sika deer across many counties in Ireland. That population is also referred to as genetically significant, mainly from the perspective that apparently they're pretty pure genetically with relation or in comparison to the original population that was introduced from Japan. So now let's unpack two things. First, where we are with the whole process of listing Sika deer as an invasive alien species, and secondly, what is its current status in Ireland. So, in terms of where we are in the process, on the 15th of May this year, listing of Sika deer on the invasive alien species list received a positive scientific opinion from Scientific Forum meeting. So that was on the 15th of May. And then on the 12th of June, which is as of time of recording this last week, the European Commission's Invasive Alien Species Committee met and discussed and voted on putting Sika deer onto this invasive alien species list. Now, there are two schools of thought. Some people say, well, that's only one process, one step in the process. There are many other steps now before the listing of a Sika deer will be agreed. And the second school of thought says, once it received a positive scientific opinion from the scientific committee and was voted by IAS committee, then now it's just a formality. One way or another, the updated IAS list is expected to be presented in the first quarter of 2025. Now, secondly, what is the current status of Sika deer in Ireland? So this is an interesting thing because from one perspective and one group of people think that, Sika deer is one of the species of wild deer in Ireland. It's a part of Irish wild fauna, and it's part of our natural heritage. And that is reflected in Wildlife Act 1976 and the further amendments, where Sika deer enjoys protection. It is a protected species, along with other two species of deer in Ireland, fallow and red deer. It is a game species, so we have a hunting season, closed season, separate for females, separate for males. But in general, it enjoys the same protections as other species of deer. Now, there's a second school of thought on this, mainly ecologists, who say, Sika deer is an invasive alien species, and ideally, it should be eradicated. It is detrimental to Irish biodiversity, Irish flora, and ideally, if we could eradicate it. And that point of view also is reflected in, for example, National Biodiversity Database, which lists Sika deer as an invasive, non-native invasive species. Now, in this episode, we will try to unpack all that, and at the end, you will have better understanding what is the situation of Sika deer, whether it is or isn't invasive, and more importantly, what that would mean for Ireland and Irish Sika deer if indeed it will be listed on the European Union's level as an invasive alien species. And because it's a quite complicated and often emotive topic, I felt again that one guest would never do the justice to such a broad topic. So today I am bringing you 3 guests in one podcast. And First of all, the podcast has a science in title, so obviously, without a scientist as a guest, that episode wouldn't happen. And so our first guest, or one of our guests, is Professor of Invasion Ecology at the Queen's University in Belfast, Professor Jamie Thomas Allen Dick. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 points of view, one like an ecological point of view, one more of a deer management hunter's perspective. And to represent the ecological point of view, our guest is award-winning author Owen Dalton. And in case you don't know, he spent 15 years on recovering Irish Atlantic rainforest on his farm on the Beara Peninsula. And he's an author, like I mentioned, best-selling author of 2 books, An Irish Atlantic Rainforest, and just recently published The Magic of an Irish Rainforest, A Visual Journey. So Owen has very practical knowledge on, recovering the native woodland, the native ecosystems of Ireland. So his point of view is very practical and definitely worth hearing. From the perspective of deer management and hunters, our guest, again on the podcast, is Damian Hannigan, who is a government appointee to the Irish Deer Management Forum and also a public relations officer at Irish Deer Commission. Now, given the length of my discussions with those guests, I couldn't possibly put the whole interviews into this podcast, just because that podcast would take probably 4 hours. And, I just wanted to make it somehow listenable for you, dear listeners. However, you can access the full versions of my interviews with Jamie, Owen, and Damian in the exclusive 3-episode series. The link is in the description of this show. You can get in there and access the full interviews. Now, having that out of the way, let's lay out foundation for today's discussion. And I think that the best foundation for further taking this topic is to understand what is invasive species, what is alien invasive species. And that baseline, as always, has to be in science. So I asked that question to Professor Jamie Dick.
There is a huge debate in the literature and among scientists and practitioners. Generally, the way I explain it to students is an invasive species is a species, plant or animal, microbe, whatever, that's come from one biogeographical realm to another, generally through human transport. Let's take something like the Chinese mitten crab from China, is now in UK, it's now in Ireland, it's in Europe. So it's come from a very different biogeographical area with different environment, different evolutionary pressures, different other species around it. And quite often those species then have impact in the new locations, such as predation, competition, disease transmission. And because they're very new to the area in an evolutionary sense, they can bring novel weapons, such as allelochemicals in plants, like Himalayan balsam, for example. They can be, the native species can be naive to the introduced species, so don't recognize them as competitors and predators. And therefore, there can be a distinct ecological and environmental impact. The EU tends to think of invasive alien species as encompassing all of that. Transport, coming from a different place, becoming established and having impact. We tend to separate out the 2 elements of invasiveness being the ability to arrive and become established in a new location, such as many species travel on boats across the Atlantic, end up in North American Great Lakes and establish and colonize, but not all have impact. Impact can be something that is almost neutral or indeed positive. Many species actually add to our environments and our islands and continental areas, but many have distinct impacts, such as zebra mussels, such as peacock bass, such as crayfish species that are moved around. So and invasiveness and impact aren't necessarily correlated. So you can be very invasive without impact. You can be very few individuals but have huge impact. The story I told this morning to my students was in 1894, a lighthouse was built on a small island called St. Stephen's near New Zealand. and the lighthouse keeper brought a cat to the island, and the cat killed the entire population and every last individual of a species of wren that lived on the island. So that's a lot of impact. But many other species we see as kind of naturalized. We see rabbits, we see certain species of deer, we see them as part of our culture, part of our food source, part of our environment. The other point is, was it human actions that brought the species? Clearly on boats it was. Clearly deliberate introductions, but there's been many incidents of things like tsunamis that have moved species across oceans. There's been climate change and natural, you might call it expansion, but climate change might be human-driven, so therefore was it by humans? So there are grey areas, and there's debate, and there's a whole quite nasty debate in invasion ecology at the moment that a group of scientists are saying that invasion ecologists say all invaders are bad, which is what we've never done. We've often said that that new species can add to communities, they can fill niches, they can fill roles and ecosystem services, but they can certainly have very, very, very nasty effects on biodiversity. Then that leads to agricultural impact, forestry impact. They can be large mammals, they can be microbes and viruses. So they're at all ends of the taxonomic spectrum. So that's it. I could go on, but that would be my view of how I would begin to explain what invasive species are to most people that without getting too technical.
Okay, now we know what an invasive species is. So now let's talk about the current status of Sika deer in Ireland. And for that, I'm turning to Damian Hennigan from the Irish Deer Commission.
Sika deer are one of our 3 deer species, obviously the other 2 being red deer, fallow deer, and all 3 species are a protected species under our Wildlife Acts. And that affords them protection in the sense of that there's a designated open season where they can only be culled under licence. And also in terms of, the various sections of the Wildlife Acts in terms of what might be perceived as a criminal offence or a crime towards a protected species would apply to Sika as well.
So how that would change if the EU would put the Sika on the Invasive Alien Species IAS list? What impact that would have for Ireland?
So I suppose it's important to probably understand at the outset maybe what the designation of an invasive alien species means as such, and I just recently attended a meeting hosted by the National Parks and Wildlife Service and the National Biodiversity Centre on behalf of the Irish Deer Commission, where we were discussing and looking at proactive measures in regards to invasive alien species in Ireland. And really, what a lot of the discussion was around early detection, eradication, predominantly kind of aquatic species that may come in, for example, through the aquatic industry or people coming fishing to Ireland. Also looked at, different plant species. So having, that discussion about Sika deer in the same context seemed a bit out of kilter really, because effectively what an invasive alien species means is it means surveillance, it means eradication of a species, and we already have previous farm in this area in the sense of the Reeves muntjac deer was added to the invasive alien species list in 2011. But with the Reeves muntjac, what we've seen, Tommy, is that it's removal of all seasons, so it's a full 12-month season for that species. And to some people, that might sound like a silver bullet in terms of deer management. God, if we have a full 12-month season, that'll solve all the problems. But the reality of the matter is that it actually creates significantly more problems than it solves. So first of all, is in terms of the biology of deer, and Sika deer are no different, is the majority of young are born in the month of June. And they lactate on their mother for about 13 to 14 weeks after birth. Then if you look at highland or upland areas as well, where maybe marginal farmland or feeding is available, the calf tends to be dependent far longer than the 13 to 14 weeks. So if you cull that female within that period of time, and predominantly in the first number of weeks after birth where the calf is hidden and the female will go away to feed on its own, effectively you're resulting in the calf starving to death in the absence of the female. secondly, I suppose in a woodland setting in particular, if you think about, the vast majority of our forests in Ireland, they're commercial Sika spruce plantations. And, while it's often possible on the open hill to cull a female and calf together, in a woodland setting, particularly when vegetation is high, it's next to impossible, to even see the calf, not alone to cull that calf. So it does create huge animal welfare issues in terms of classifying any deer species as an invasive alien species. The other issue it creates as well is that we know from research undertaken here in Ireland is that in terms of hunting pressure with Sika, where Sika, like all deer species, are highly adaptable, and they will have three basic requirements, and that's food, shelter, and peace and quiet, and particularly the latter, in terms of hunting pressure, excessive pressure on Sika. They've been shown to range up to 25 kilometres in a 12-month period. So in terms of if we suddenly decide in the morning that we're going to vilify Sika and create a 12-month season, you're effectively going to cause deer to spread faster than a balanced approach to deer management. The other issue that it creates is, and it's kind of topical, in Scotland at the moment, where they've removed the open seasons for male deer, is that, and particularly red stags, is that, post-rut here in Ireland, again in marginal or upland areas, Sika males are very much a spent force. They're losing up to 20-25% of their body weight. If you have a tough winter or if there's lack of feeding available, it's a tough period for male Sika deer, for stags. And from a meat quality or venison point of view, really they're a bag of bones at that stage. There's no really economic or venison quality value within the meat at that stage. So they're just some of the issues that creating or changing the designation of a species to an invasive alien species creates as such.
Okay, so at this point, we know what an invasive alien species is, as well as what is the current status of Sika deer in Ireland. Now, let's discuss the impact the Sika deer have on native Irish ecosystems. And for that, no better person than Owen Dalton, who spent 15 years recovering Irish Atlantic rainforest. Owen, you are at the forefront of the movement to restore Irish native ecosystems and Irish native rainforest. What were your thoughts when you first learned that European Commission is moving to potentially list Sika deer as an invasive species in Europe?
My thoughts were finally a little bit of sanity on the horizon, to be quite honest. You have a species, Sika deer, that were introduced to Ireland in the 1860s from Far East Asia. They fulfill every criteria of how an invasive species is defined, and yet they're legally protected in this country. It's absolutely bonkers, and it's about time something was done about it.
When you were working on your wonderful project and you wrote a book about the Irish and Atlantic rainforest, what were the impacts of Sika deer that you saw?
So when I moved to the Beara Peninsula in 2009, I bought a 73-acre farm here. And what attracted me to this particular piece of land was that, for reasons I didn't know at the time, that the farm hadn't been used for quite a long time agriculturally, for about a century before we came. And that had allowed wild native habitats to reform on much of the land, including this absolutely gorgeous native forest, which I subsequently came to understand was actually temperate rainforest. So you had this really beautiful, rich ecosystem, but it was completely and utterly devastated. And that was primarily down to overgrazing by feral goats, but Sika deer had an important hand in what was happening to the place as well. And I would describe both. I think anybody who is ecologically minded would describe both feral goats and Sika deer as invasive species. And the effect that they were having was, first of all, they were preventing the forest from regenerating. So every last tree seedling that germinated, every little oak, every birch, hazel, willow, everything else was just immediately eaten. So the forest was unable to regenerate. As well, the really rich ground flora that you should have in such a native forest was completely absent. It had just been stripped bare, stripped out completely. The goats and the deer were also stripping the bark off the tree, some of the mature trees, which kills a tree if it goes all the way around the tree. The tree will die. So the whole forest was littered with dead, older trees. And on top of all that, the severe overgrazing had created the ideal conditions for takeover by another invasive species, Rhododendron ponticum, and a whole bunch of other invasive plant species. But rhododendron was the worst of them, really. So the whole place was in total ecological meltdown, and the root cause of the problem was overgrazing by invasive herbivore species, Sika deer and feral goats. Now, in what happened is I applied for a grant under a scheme called the Native Woodland Scheme to fence out the goats and the Sika. And in the meantime, I set about getting rid of the rhododendron and about 7 or 8 other invasive plant species. And then the fence was erected under the Native Woodland Scheme around most of the land. And between all of those restorative acts, the results were really spectacular. The place just started to absolutely explode with life. So you had tree seedlings springing up all over the place, and in many parts they've been able to go on to form new rainforest where previously there were just grasses. And within the existing forest, there's been a complete transformation as well. That you've got this really rich ground flora there now of hugely diverse ferns and all sorts of other plants, and in the spring it's just a carpet of wildflowers, all of which was absent in the past. And it's been absolutely, it's been such a fantastic joy to see this complete renaissance of this natural ecosystem. But the really painful side of it is to walk out of my small place, and it's not that big, and go anywhere else and see the whole place is down here in the Beara Peninsula and the southwest. Native habitats are just devastated by overgrazing, almost entirely by Sika deer. Sika are a massive problem here. People are always crashing into them. If I have to drive from here to Kenmare, which is about 35-minute trip or so, if I have to do that early in the morning for work or something, if I have to travel around or just before dawn, I'll have to dodge a dozen or more Sika over that course of 35 minutes. The place is literally just coming down with them. And yet, as I say, they're a protected species. So you've got this absolutely ludicrous situation where a species that's destroying our native habitats, and I guess it's important to contextualize when I say, You know, I mean, if you go to Killarney National Park, it's in absolute bits, in the same state as my place was when I arrived. And the same goes for Urach, which is here on the Beara Peninsula. It's one of our very few remaining pieces of ancient pre-1660 woodland. And it's grazed absolutely bare, you know, and travel the length and breadth of Ireland and visit the tiny little remnants that we have left of forest, of native forest. And that's generally what you're going to find. And it's it's largely due to invasive species of deer, primarily Sika. Fallow also, I believe, although I'd be less familiar with fallow because you don't have any in this part of Ireland. And I think, you know, just to finish up on this by saying that we have to remember here that, you know, Ireland, it's estimated that around 80% of Ireland was once covered in native forest. And we're down now to only around somewhere like 1%, maybe 1.5% maximum. And only a tiny proportion of that is old woodland. And virtually all of these places are completely trashed by overgrazing. And that overgrazing very often is being carried out by a protected species. It's completely insane.
Do you see the overgrazing? Because in the context of overgrazing, quite often we hear about sheep, that the sheep are the main culprit of overgrazing. So I'm curious, if you had to guess in a scale of Ireland, like what is the percentage of the damage that is caused specifically by Sika deer versus everything else that's going on, including sheep, including goats, and, you know, other species of deer, like you mentioned, fallow or red deer?
Well, I think you have to start off by saying that virtually the whole island of Ireland is overgrazed. You know, there's almost nowhere on this whole island that isn't overgrazed. So if you get in your car and drive across Ireland, you're just going to go through a landscape of endless fields with sheep or cows grazing them to the point. And when I say overgrazed, I think that anywhere where you have a grazing regime that doesn't allow the natural regeneration of wild native trees and other important flora, you can characterize that as overgrazed. So, you know, I'll start answering your question by saying virtually this entire island is overgrazed, okay, by something. Now, the difference between the likes of sheep and Sika deer is that sheep are livestock, so they are fenced in generally. They don't range wild, so sheep will be, if they're lowland sheep, they'll be in a field. If they're upland sheep, they'll be ranging across a commonage, but they'll still be fenced in within that commonage. Sika and goats, on the other hand, are different because they are wild and they go where they want. They can jump fences that sheep can't. So, you know, a 3-foot fence will prevent sheep from moving so long as it's in a good state of repair. Whereas that deer would just kind of like skip over that, and the same with goats. So what we have by having this situation in which Sika are a protected species, we're essentially maintaining a situation whereby sheep and cattle are grazing all of the parts of the landscape that are farmed, if you like, while goats and Sika and fallow are kind of ensuring that all the other bits that should be in the wilds, that are more wild and that aren't farmed, that they're overgrazed also. So it's a huge problem, and it makes absolutely no sense that a species that was introduced in the 1860s from Far East Asia and has exploded in numbers and is causing massive ecological damage and economic damage. You know, accidents down here are frequent. There are people who've been killed Another issue down in parts of the country like this, with the numbers of deer that we have, are ticks and Lyme disease. So, for example, in my place, when I first came here in 2009, whenever I'd go into the woods, I would come out with somewhere between a half dozen and a dozen ticks crawling up my legs, my trouser legs, and sometimes even attached to my arm or something like that. As soon as once the deer fence went up to exclude the goats and the Sika, the ticks just disappeared, virtually disappeared. So I'm not saying that I would never find a tick in there now, but you're talking like maybe one or two a year, whereas previously it was, as I say, half a dozen or to a dozen every single time I went in. So, ticks are vectors for Lyme disease, and this parts of Ireland like this have a massive issue now with Lyme disease, because people go out into their gardens, they go for a walk and they get ticks, and they catch Lyme disease from that, and it can be a hugely debilitating disease, So for so many different reasons, but for me, the primary one is ecology. Like when Ireland is one of the most nature trashed countries on the planet, and we're allowing the tiny little remnants that we have left to continue to die through overgrazing by a legally protected species that was introduced in the 1860s from Far East Asia. It's absolutely mad.
So if at this point you're a little bit confused as to what is the status of Sika deer in Ireland, really, you're not the only one. I was also a little bit confused. So let's dig deeper with Professor Jamie Dick. How is it that Sika deer is, by, for example, National Biodiversity Database, listed as invasive species, and at the same time it is a protected species under Wildlife Act with open and closed season for sport hunting and all, the whole deal?
And it's the same in Northern Ireland. It's the same in UK. There's populations of Sika, and I've seen them in Scotland and England. I'm not so sure about Wales at the moment. So under my definition of an invasive species, Sika clearly qualify because they've come from a different biogeographical region. Japan and various other places, there's various races of Sika. They've been brought by humans. They have been soft released, i.e. they've been looked after and allowed to get into the environment in a way that it's not so harsh that they die, which is often what happens. A lot of invasions, they just fail. Soft releases, hard releases, kicking them out. Soft releases, helping them on their way. And they have established populations in the wild in these new locations. Let's take Ireland, for example. I think Lord Powerscourt is credited with bringing them in the
1860.
Very, very few individuals soft release, and I've seen them in Powerscourt Estate and around Wicklow and places, and they're in captivity up the road from me, and they have escaped, and they're running around breeding in County Down now. So I've seen that with my own eyes, and I do a bit of deer stalking and deer management. I work for the British Deer Society as well, so very aware of all these issues. And they have impact, although you could argue so do native deer, such as red deer, but that's more of a population size and distribution and impact sort of scenario that we recognise with all deer species that are either poorly managed or don't have wolves and things to look after the population. So they clearly qualify as an invasive species. Now, just to contrast it slightly with fallow, fallow came in a lot earlier, probably in the 1500s. And many people see them as naturalised, and it's a slight difference in this debate about invasive versus native versus naturalised.
Yeah, you're already jumping ahead, because that's my another one. It was 1169 actually.
Yeah. And rabbits and it turns out that the crayfish in Ireland were probably brought in by monks from France. So are they native? We're all trying to protect the native crayfish, and some would point out, well, depending on how far back you go, many things are not native. They're introduced in the fish world. It's a huge debate on pike, things like that. But within reasonably short period of time, a few hundred years of being introduced and becoming invasive and problematic in some respects, I think qualifies deer, Sika deer as invasive. And I'm relatively happy with that, but I'm also happy with the idea that they've been here long enough that they've become naturalized, widely distributed. And as a sentient being that many people have a fondness for, deer have had protection traditionally in the UK and Ireland. So, for example, in the UK, deer would be protected under the Wildlife Act and the Wildlife Order. Scotland has similar legislation. And a lot of that protection is based on, and the roe deer, for example, in Scotland was treated as a pest for many years. The reason the British Deer Society exists is because they were reacting against the treatment of deer as vermin and the lack of protection they had legally. So the legislation protects them in the sense that, for example, the seasons, as you might know, you'll know well actually, and many people will know, are there that you can't shoot particularly female deer when they may have dependent young. And therefore the seasons reflect the breeding cycle of Sika, red and fallow in particular, and roe across the British Isles. Muntjac are a different situation because they breed all year, and Chinese water deer are a bit different as well. So I think on welfare grounds the protection is reasonable to prevent as far as possible the death of young animals because they've become orphaned. And also, I think deer were traditionally seen as relatively rare and located in particular forests and places that meant that the population should be almost cultured and looked after than not wiped out, not eradicated. So there was also a sort of conservation angle to that, which has probably become less of a force because conservation, it would now be seen as being compromised by deer expansion and populations and species arriving, such that the conservation side of protection is, as we've seen in Scotland, a drive now to have much harsher population control. Think of New Zealand, where they use helicopters for control of deer because they have become fallow and red have become problematic. But certainly from a welfare point of view, although you can with good culling, you can make sure that dependent deer are not left to starve. And there are situations where deer do need quite severe control and perhaps eradication. It's been done in islands and New Zealand, for example, with deer and goats and whatnot. So they both qualify as an invasive species. I would say erring into the side of naturalised part of our community. We need to really look after them now. I don't think eradication is possible at all in any of the British Isles. But they get protection for welfare and conservation reasons. And a lot of legislation, remember, is way out of date with respect to the current problems. So in 2024, is legislation that was written in the 70s really relevant? There have been changes in some of the legislation, but it's been particularly lacking in some parts of the British Isles that were not following the science, the evidence, the impact, the problems, climate change-driven issues. So I think we need to revisit legislation. Perhaps the EU legislation was supposed to address that, but well, that's another question.
Well, I also asked the same question to Damien Hennigan.
I'm sure I saw that one website already here in Ireland where Sika, as you mentioned, that people already call them an invasive alien species. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that any designation of any species is not an issue for Ireland as a country or the Irish government. It's actually undertaken by an invasive alien species within the European Union. And currently at the moment, Sika in Ireland are not classified as an invasive alien species. And that process is currently ongoing at the moment. And effectively what that involves is that you have a scientific committee within the IAS committee or Invasive Alien Species Committee in the EU that undertakes a risk assessment of a species in terms of potential designation as an invasive alien species. And where we're at with Sika at the moment is that in recent months, that risk assessment was completed, and it was positive in a recommendation of Sika being made as an invasive alien species. But this is only one very small cog in the wheel of the entire process. The next stage is that just before the end of this year, the overarching IAS committee will meet, which is made up of all member states of the EU. And our representative on that in Ireland is the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and typically Dr. Ferdy Marnell is our representative. And we will be in close communication with Ferdy on this. And effectively, the next stage of the process will be is that if that committee decides to move ahead in the process, is that we will have a public consultation on an EU portal called Have Your Say. And that'll be open for approximately 1 month. And it typically happens about 6 months before the final decision is made. And that final decision then will be made roughly in about Q3, Q4 of 2024. So if that designation then was decided that Sika should be reclassified as an invasive alien species, then each member state has 18 months to implement a surveillance and management plan. Okay. And two very important points, Tommy, around this is that, first of all, is that the risk assessment that was produced by the scientific committee, while an excellent document in its own right, in our view, would be a significantly flawed document because, the rationale behind reclassifying Sika as an invasive alien species could very much apply to goats, any of our deer species, many of our herbivores. They're very much, they speak about things about hybridization and things like that, which, other than in County Wicklow, which was a man-made situation here in Ireland, when Sika were introduced in 1860, we know Sika have coexisted in County Kerry with red deer since 1864, and hybridization has never taken place. And the reason for that is that it is a man-made situation because a red stag is too large to breed with a Sika hind, and vice versa, a Sika stag is too small to breed with a red hind. So the danger is when you do have hybrids in the wider ecosystem is that obviously they're larger than a Sika and smaller than a red, and they do have the ability to breed with red deer. And we've seen in County Wicklow now where there's no red deer, we have only hybrids or Sika deer. But as I said, with the exception of County Wicklow, that hasn't taken place anywhere else in Ireland. So really the rationale in terms of in that risk assessment is that it really, when you read it and if you deleted the word Sika from that document, it could apply to many, many other species, So we would see it flawed in that context. So really is that I mentioned that once, if Sika, and it is an if because we've been here before in terms of potential classification of Sika as an invasive alien species, but if this does happen, as I mentioned, it would be 18 months for each member state, but there is a derogation in place. And there's a 3-stage process, or checklist is probably a better word to use in regards to that derogation, that if it's unfeasible in terms of to eradicate that species, and it goes through a number of different headings. I'm just reading my own notes here. It was technically unfeasible. The cost-benefit analysis of it is unrealistic, and eradication methods are not available. So they were the 3. So if you meet any one of those criteria in regards to a species, so if you take, as I mentioned, in the case of Sika in Ireland, they're here since 1860. They're present in every county, as they are in many other countries in the EU. If you take, Tommy, your home country, just looking there, they've been present in Poland since 1895. So again, well established. But where this has come about is that in the Netherlands and Belgium had very, very recent introductions of Sika, and really where this is where the push has really come about in regards to the classification. So really from an Irish context, as a hunter yourself, Tommy, you'll know from County Kerry, the terrain and the habitat that Sika exists in, and the realities of management of that species is quite difficult. For the most educated and experienced deer stalker, it's quite a challenging job to do that. So really, what we would have been calling on Minister Malcolm Noonan, the Minister with responsibility is to ensure that obviously the derogation applies to Ireland if it is the case that the species is classified as an invasive alien species. Just one further point, Tommy, if I can, on that is that in terms of, it's one thing to have the derogation in place, but a concern for many hunters and people involved in deer management is that when you start attaching that tag of invasive alien species, and I forgot to use this word earlier, it reduces the species to the level of vermin. That's what effectively what it does. And what we have seen increasingly is that, particularly in the last kind of 18 to 24 months, is that we've seen a lot of hate speech towards deer. And I know that's a very strong term to use, and there's a fine line between opinion and hate speech, and probably my own thought on it would be is that hate speech is where it incites somebody to go out and do something, negative, or maybe possibly to commit an offence towards a person or a species. And, we have seen examples of where deer are now just shot, and just left to rot in fields, or rot in forests, because they're considered vermin, So it's really, and you've probably heard me say this before, Tommy, is that it is really, really crucial in terms of when we're having discussions around managing deer, because we all understand that deer has to be managed, and we understand that deer can have negative impacts on the wider ecosystem, and they can also have positive impacts on the wider ecosystem as well. But the important caveat is when they're managed at sustainable numbers. But it is really important for people when they do make comments in the media, that they have, a knowledge, or an understanding. Obviously, it's a emotive topic, no matter what country I'm in Europe, or I talk to people in other organisations. It's an emotive topic, deer management. It's an emotive from the land use, from the farming, from the forestry, from rewilders, from environmentalists. It is an emotive topic, and not trying to deny that. And as I said, deer do have a negative impact only when the numbers are unsustainable. But not enough people understand the benefits deer as eco-engineers in the countryside, the benefits that they do bring to the countryside, but when managed properly. But as I said, it is concerning in particularly the last 18 to 24 months, the amount of misinformed comment that we see. And that's with all respects to those individuals in terms of their own opinions, and we live in a democracy. But it does have consequences because we do see hate crimes towards deer. We do then see a pressure being applied to, political representatives. And, as I said, those decisions around numbers of deer, it's critical that they're evidence and they're scientific based, and they're not simply arbitrary seat of the pants comments, maybe as a result of landowner or political pressure. We really owe that to a protected species like deer and so on.
What do you feel when you hear those comments from ecologists, often high-profile ecologists, who would essentially seek their eradicated? What goes through your mind?
Yeah, it's. I suppose my immediate thought, really, Tommy, would be when I hear those statements is that, again, with respect to those individuals, they clearly don't fully understand deer and deer management or deer biology, in terms of, in the sense of that when deer are managed, as I just mentioned, at sustainable levels, but the positive impact and the eco-engineers that they are. And we've, just in your own county, Down County Kerry, a significant piece of research undertaken through researchers in Trinity, where they effectively looked at 3 scenarios over a long number of years where you completely fenced out an area and excluded deer, where you didn't manage deer, and where you managed deer at sustainable levels. Now, in recent days, I just spoke to 23 ecologists and staff from the Acres and the Hen Harrier project, and I asked that question, which of the 3 scenarios do you believe gave the best outcome? And the best outcome, no surprise, was when deer were managed at a sustainable level, because in the other 2 scenarios, when deer weren't managed, you ended up in a desert situation where nothing was regenerating. There was no regeneration of woodlands. There was damage to habitat, and so on. And then the 3rd scenario, when you fence deer out completely, and I've seen this, at first hand just recently in Scotland, where you have huge areas that on one side of the fence is a desert and on the other side is a jungle. And, it's really 2 things happen there. Is that one is that, the that jungle on the other side of the fence, while people think, this is a good thing, I'm growing trees, what you'll find is a lot of the species in terms of the native trees never get a chance to take off because, they're overwhelmed by other species. But equally what you're seeing as well is that the first storm or the first breach of that fence, when deer or other herbivores get inside that fence, is that you then have created an environment that's absolutely impossible to manage from a deer management point of view. It's a jungle, and I've been in some of them myself. It's absolutely next to impossible to manage them. Rather than taking the approach of sort of saying, okay, we want to grow trees and we need to grow trees, and how do we manage deer and other herbivores, that have negative impacts on growing trees? How do we manage them at a level that allows us to do that? And it's that point is what a lot of people are missing, in terms of how you manage. And they do it in lots of countries very successfully, in terms of management. But obviously, if you're in an area or a situation where you have high density of deer, you're going to see a lot of tree damage, a lot of negative impacts on the ecosystem. Even Killarney National Park, we see it there, in terms of this pressure, not alone from the deer. We've a growing wild goat population. We've a significant number of sheep now grazing within the park, and other herbivores. So there's significant pressure on the wider ecosystem of the park in general.
Similar concerns are related to feral goats and foxes that you mentioned. These are other animals where it's like no season. Do you any concerns around those, or is it Sika like special?
Yeah, it's. I mentioned earlier that I had recently attended the National Parks and the National Biodiversity Centre organised 2 events, one in Limerick and one in Dublin, on a framework, for invasive alien species. And just before we broke for lunch, a conservation ranger with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and he shouted out a question: what about Sika deer and fallow deer? When are we going to have them made an invasive species? And and then we broke for lunch, and I spoke to this lady, and I said, I was just intrigued by your comment in the sense of, fallow deer and Sika deer. What's your motivation behind that comment? And she was very much of the view, it's a conservation measure. And I said, what about red deer? And and I said, look, is that what about other herbivores? We've had recent introductions of sheep species, and different things into farms, so. Because, I think people kind of forget. I just heard a politician say in recent days, about, that he was declaring war on Sika and, but he had a thing for the red deer. And, I think, obviously people, red deer are an iconic species, but so are all deer. I think to see a wild deer in the countryside is if you're not used to looking at deer, it's a memory that will stick in your head, and they are an iconic species. But all deer species, red deer included, have negative impacts when they're not managed. They all need to be managed at a number. And we know, again, from the most recent data that over 55,000 deer are being culled annually in Ireland. So when people call for national deer culls, we already are undertaking substantial deer culls in Ireland. And obviously those numbers don't include, the growing number of deer involved in road traffic accidents, and those deer that are killed illegally or through deer poaching. So while that data, again, is not independently verified, it is very much a very good guide to what's happening on the ground in terms of the numbers of deer that have been culled each year. And I know the indication I'm getting, the most recent data has increased further on that again. So I think, hunters, we have 6,500 licensed deer hunters in Ireland, are reacting and doing their, playing their part in terms of managing deer. So we are seeing more and more deer culled. But coming back to the point I was making, Tommy, in regards to, deer, when I spoke to this lady, she really couldn't give me an answer in terms of why Sika and fallow and why not red deer, and other herbivores such as goats and hares obviously have negative impacts on new plantations. And really couldn't give me an answer to the question. And she said, look, we've been shooting foxes for years and leaving cubs to starve to death. In dens and so on. And I found it somewhat mystified, as such, because effectively what that person was saying is deer should be vermin, that's what it's saying, is that deer should be vermin, and really, that kind of statement shocked me when you think of the purpose of, and we're all entitled to views and opinions and so on, but it's, I think, deer are, as I said, a particular species. They are deserving of respect, and how we manage them. they are an asset, both, scenic, economic and sporting. If Tommy, you were kind enough to join us on our Red Deer Rough Watch event this year in Killarney National Park, and you saw the large attendance and the amount of photographers around, talking to people in the hotel and restaurant. It's a huge economic boost for Killarney and for Kerry in general, as it is in Wicklow during the Ruck, because I think Irish people and people from around the world have a graph for deer. Obviously, if you're one of those people that look out into your field and you see 30 or 40 deer in the field, you may not have as much of a graph for them, but it's and we genuinely need to support those people, in terms of farmers and foresters that do have a genuine problem with deer. And I think, they've never been found wanting in terms of the support of our own members, and deer hunters in general, are always willing and only too willing to support our landowners that have genuine problems.
Well, so at this point, it is clear to me that the main concern around listing Sika deer as an invasive alien species is around animal welfare. So I had to ask Owen about animal welfare aspects, and what is his view on this? Would you have any concerns about the welfare of what would be happening then to Sika deer? Because obviously, I presume you are concerned to a degree about the welfare. How would you still see certain rules apply? How you can do this, or would it be like only trained sharpshooters and then excluding hunters from day one, or would you again think that there's some level of regulations would be still required to ensure the humane dispatch, if you like?
I think any kind of killing of anything living has to be done humanely and has to be done right. You don't want injured animals, adult females being shot and leaving their young behind. You don't want that kind of a thing. But I think that needs to be approached through kind of culture, and that's where the deer hunting organizations could help in terms of just telling their members to be mindful of considerations like that. But like what I would say is that if you have American mink that are killing off native fauna on a horrendous scale, or I don't know, grey squirrels. Imagine that the pine martens weren't dealing with the grey squirrel problem so effectively, and grey squirrels had to be shot. None of these kind of considerations, nobody would even talk about anything like this, because they just say, well, it's a massive problem, we have to do something about it. And the more people who are shooting grey squirrels or trapping mink or whatever it is, the better. And the same goes for feral goats. None of these kind of considerations are seen to apply with feral goats. And lots of other species that you couldn't describe as invasive, but are categorized as vermin, like foxes. Now, they're not categorized as vermin by me. I'm just saying this is the official categorization. Foxes and rabbits and so on. None of this stuff applies for any of these species. So why are Sika different? We need to ask ourselves, why are Sika different? It's a mindset, and it's a mindset. I think that's the Bambi syndrome, as I described it, is a big part of that. But I think also it's something that's used by those who are opposed to classifying Sika as what they are, which is an invasive species. It's used by those people as a way of preventing any kind of change. When we're talking about the animal welfare side of, for example, loosening up the legislation around hunting Sika, people need to go and visit places where there are a lot of Sika. And what they'll see are the Sika have reproduced to the point where they've completely, exceeded the carrying capacity of the landscape they're living in, and they've eaten out everything, and they're starving to death. I have seen Sika deer in Killarney National Park staggering about with all their ribs showing, because they have nothing to eat. There's nothing there except mosses, which of course they can't eat. So if you're talking about this from an animal welfare perspective, that's even more reason for changing the legislation to make Sika an invasive species that can be, that are far more easily hunted.
Well, I think these are all very strong arguments, but at the end of the day, I would always like to come back to the scientific point of view. Do you have any comments on the kind of response to that? That, for example, there's a number of species like feral goats or foxes, where you might make an argument like this is the same welfare concern should apply, and yet they're not protected. Their welfare. We don't care about the welfare. Why we should care about the welfare of Sika deer if we don't care about welfare of foxes or feral goat?
As a person who follows the science in terms of invasions, I do a lot of welfare research as well. I'm a hunter. I don't ever deny that to anybody. But I think responsible hunting and control and eradication can be done with welfare in mind if it's done properly. I mean, when you have young deer and hinds, or female deer hinds and their calves, and you have does and youngsters, you can cull out of season under license, or in countries where there is no seasons, you can cull responsibly. You can make sure that the youngsters aren't orphaned, for example, by shooting the youngsters first. So I think responsible control and management can be done. The problem is the hangover of legislation that is not fit for current purpose. And foxes, for example, I would be involved in control of foxes where they're problematic, and I do try to make sure that that's done at times of the year where we're not orphaning. There are other, birds, like pigeons are shot all year, crows are shot all year. I think people like myself do recognise that issue and try our very best, whilst at the same time the pressures of farmers, foresters, the fishing community with things like cormorants, there are pressures to deal with these species. So I think on an individual level and as groups of people, we can be responsible cullers with respect to welfare. And I'm also very against the idea of more and more legislation, more and more protection, because those who are unwilling to follow legislation or do have an attitude of who cares, it's very, very difficult to deal with those kind of people. Better that it's done, for example, in deer management groups where you get together. I've formed a deer management group. We get together, we coordinate, collaborate, and keep those elements away from the situation and keep the land free from, the badger baiters, the fox, some of the practices that I don't like. We keep off of the land whilst at the same time engaging in responsible culling. So I think moving deer into fox, rabbit type scenarios doesn't need to happen in terms of the idea that you can kill them all year and with disregard for welfare. I think we can manage deer at all times of the year responsibly, if that is what is required in the circumstances, and not all circumstances require year-round control. We could do a better job of it, I think, in particular at night, where we now have thermal technology. I'm a great fan of thermal. I have a lot of thermal equipment for my research. I think it's safe. I think it's effective. And I think we can use that technology and develop new skills to favour deer management that is of conservation value to them and to other parts of the community, and to welfare concerns. And I think, again, the legislation hasn't kept up. So Scotland has just literally within the last months managed to get legislation through to use thermal. Northern Ireland say that we can't use thermal. Down south, you're somewhere in the vicinity of perhaps using thermal under licence. In England, you can use thermal during the day. Nighttime shooting has been very much of a no-no for many, many decades, although it is carried out under licence in Scotland and England and down south, not so much in Northern Ireland. But I think the technology now means that night shooting is not under lamps, which are a very limited field of view. Night vision has its limitations. Thermal, the new thermal is just phenomenal in its ability to make safe shooting, focus shooting, recognize species, recognize age classes. I have this kit. It is fantastic. And we really need to embrace that and bring legislation and the civil servants and the NGOs and others along with us, rather than putting barriers in our way based on old legislation. I've had fights over night shooting with people who frankly don't understand the technology or how this would work and don't want the potential kickback that this is some kind of terrible, unsafe, nasty, disturbing way of doing things. So that's my view as a practitioner, scientist, and someone who, with a lot of respect for animals and animal welfare and conservation.
So at this point, I am wondering, is it possible to improve deer management measures, especially in relation to Sika deer, to maintain some population, but at the same time prevent all the negative impacts, and not listed as an invasive species in Ireland, and potentially open the way to classify this species of deer as naturalized in the future? I presume from this conversation that you think that the current ways of controlling deer are not sufficient, which is mainly through the recreational hunters and organized calls from time to time. Would you like to see the Sika deer being permanently eradicated from Ireland, or would you be in favor of somewhat, increased measures to manage their population, to control their population?
So if in a kind of an alternate universe there was a kind of a button in front of me that I could press and Sika would all just kind of disappear from Ireland, I would press that button, yes. However, I don't think that's going to I doubt that would be possible. I think that's just not going to happen. They're so prevalent across so much of the island. When you're hunting deer, the first few are always the easiest to shoot, and then it gets more and more difficult as the survivors become more and more wary. So, whether it's a practical consideration, prospect or not, I doubt it, But that doesn't mean that we can't approach this in a very, very different way to the way we're approaching it. I was invited there last year by a Scottish rewilding organisation called Scotland the Big Picture to go over there, and I was hosted in a place in a part of the Eastern Cairngorms called Glenfeshie, where there's a stalking estate that was bought by. It was a stalking estate. And it was bought by a Danish billionaire called Anders Povelsen. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, and he said once he bought it, and the place is about 60,000 acres, I think, or 55,000 acres or something, very, very big, massive by Irish standards. And there was nothing there. The whole place was grazed absolutely to the bone by elevated population number densities of deer. Apart from the odd few geriatric kind of aging, dying trees, and he brought in a team of shooters to start reducing the deer numbers, and they brought the densities down from above 40 per square kilometre down to less than 1. And the result was that, and I saw this with my own eyes, a whole valleys coming back to life with trees springing up everywhere, all sorts of species moving in, all sorts of rare species moving back in, a whole ecosystem being reborn. And it was all down to reducing the number of deer. But what was interesting about that, because the guy who was showing us around, who was working for Scotland the Big Picture at the time, a fella called James, funnily enough, his surname is Shooter. And James is quite friendly with the people who were carrying out the culling at Glenfeshie. So he was able to kind of fill us in on how it was done. And what I found interesting was that he said that essentially it was done at night. So I guess they had to get some kind of a special permit to allow night shooting, but they'd go out at night and they'd shoot a dozen or more deer in a night, one or two guys. Whereas the same one or two guys, if they were hunting during the day, they'd be lucky to get one or two deer. So night shooting was the way they did it. But that's, of course, is illegal in Ireland with Sika because they're a protected species. So the fact that they are a protected species, like if we compare, for example, the two species that were causing the ecological devastation in my place, feral goats and Sika deer, they both fit the bill 100% as regards how you would define an invasive species. But legally, they're in completely different categories. So with feral goats, there's no season. You don't need a special license to shoot them. You just need to have a license for the firearm you're using. There's no minimum caliber. There's no, you'd be quite, as far as I understand it, you'd be within the law to shoot them at night. None of the restrictions apply, whereas all of that applies with Sika deer. There's a very clearly defined season for the stags and another season for the hinds, and you can only do it during daylight hours, and you need a minimum caliber, and you need a license, and you need permission to shoot the ground. We're in a situation in which we have this massive problem, of an invasive species. We're trying to fight it with one hand tied behind our back completely.
Do you think that promoting recreational deer hunting would or wouldn't be a good idea for controlling Sika numbers? Because one of the things that I am pondering, like why it is happening, that the environmental organizations who are complaining, let's say, or are concerned, is a better word, they are concerned about impact of deer on the native flora. In my head, they should be promoting recreational deer hunting. They should say, like, yeah, let's get healthy meat and help the ecosystem. This is not happening for different reasons. I'm curious of your view on this, on like why this is happening. Would that be a good idea if that happened?
Yeah, I think it's complex. I think obviously the more people who go out and shoot deer, the better in ecological terms. So on that level, it's something that, yeah, I'm all for it. I'm all for people promoting, people doing that. However, I think the danger with that is that we start to see something like Sika as a resource that needs to be maintained rather than as a massive ecological problem that needs to be dealt with as such. I think that the problem with with deer hunting as a sport is that its primary objective isn't ecology. It's not ecosystems. What it's about is having lots of stuff to shoot. And that leads to very, very different outcomes in terms of what people are pushing for, So they're not, for example, as far as I understand it, the Irish deer hunting organisations are very much opposed to the idea of Sika being classified as an invasive species, and that absolutely illustrates what I'm speaking about. I would, however, say that I think as things stand, hunters are they're the only thing standing between total and utter death of what pieces of native forest and other ecosystems we have left, They're the only thing. They're the only people who are out there actually making a difference in that sense. Along with, I guess, NPWS rangers and people like that. But I think ideally what we should be looking for is a kind of a way in which we can work together, whereby we can get hunters on board to do what they do, because they're the people who have the expertise. They're the people, not just the expertise. They're the ones who are prepared to get out there in the rain and the midges and to actually do it. But we need to get them to start looking at things from an ecological point of view, because ecology has to be the bottom line here, not continuing to have lots of stuff to shoot.
And now let's see what is the hunter's perspective. Damien, so do you think that the current deer management measures in terms of deer being mainly managed by recreational hunters, do you feel like they're sufficient? Or do you think that they should be step up?
Yeah, I would say, probably, first of all, if we look at the cull returns, and it's not, people say, oh, we've too many deer, and we have to forget, and it's not that we need to know every deer that we have in the country, but we don't have a population census undertaken anywhere in Ireland, so we really don't know the extent of the issue. So I suppose first of all is that I think without cost to the taxpayer, deer hunters at their own expense, and it is an expensive pastime to be involved in, in terms of equipment and ammunition and so on. At their own cost, they already undertake a hugely important role, in terms of culling, probably in the regions north of 60,000 deer annually each year without cost, as I said. That being said, is when you look at the cull returns, the counties of Wicklow, for example, makes up 1/3 of the entire national cull. And then when you can add in counties Waterford, Cork, Kerry, Tipperary, Galway and Mayo, they make up 75% of the national cull. And even within those counties, obviously there's areas that are conflict areas. That's not based on any scientific evidence, Tommy, but what I would sort of say is just talking to our own members on the ground, talking to other stakeholder groups, and particularly Wicklow really is the problem area. It's the epicenter really of deer in Ireland, in the sense of that we've the largest national park, we've the largest amount of Department of Defence land in the Glen of the Mall, we've lots of large private estates there, which all these act as reservoirs for our deer. So we do see photographic and video evidence, and our members on the ground that manage deer in those areas, that Wicklow is a unique situation. And sometimes it's important that we don't confuse Wicklow with the rest of Ireland, because it is very different. That's not to suggest within some of those other counties that I mentioned, and maybe counties I didn't mention, that is that there will be problem areas. So I suppose I've been involved, Tommy, with deer all my adult life, and I've always been involved in the kind of recreational side of it, and so on. And I suppose from recent years of going to other countries such as Scotland and other parts of Europe, and talking to people on the ground there, is that you can see in some areas, yes, deer hunters can, in the vast majority of areas, can manage deer sustainability, but they are areas that requires dedicated resources, and the starting point will be our national parks, because we had a period, for example, in your own local national park, Tommy, in Killarney National Park, where 2009 to 2019, when we had a very tough recession and economic time here in Ireland, as a lot of us will remember, is that it was a time when resources in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, no fault of conservation rangers themselves, were greatly, reduced, and we had a recruitment freeze. So you had very little deer management took place within our national parks, and particularly in Killarney and Wicklow National Parks. So the consequences of that, as we well know, deer can effectively triple in number every 5 years if not managed. So, we need dedicated resources within our national parks. We need dedicated resources on our other state-owned lands, such as the Department of Defence, because we're not seeing enough deer management in those areas. And if you are an adjoining landowner or forester, in any of those areas, you're going to have a problem with deer. There's no getting away with it. And that's not the fault of hunters. We don't allow hunting in our national parks, obviously. And we don't allow hunting on our state lands in regards to, with the exception of your Quilcha, but in terms of military land and so on. So those areas do act as reservoirs for deer and do cause issues. But the greatest challenge that one of the greatest challenges that we're facing at the moment, Tommy, is that, as you know from some of your previous guests, in terms of there is a real focus, obviously, in terms of climate emergency and planting trees and so on. And it's positive that we're planting trees, but if we don't do it in an appropriate manner, we are actually creating a storm ahead of us in terms of deer. Because when I go to other countries and I walk into a state forest or a semi-state forest or private forest, it's laid out and is planned for deer management. You have wide fire breaks, you have deer lawns, you have plantations in a way that allows deer management. Where here in Ireland, we have wall-to-wall Sika spruce, or we plant Sika spruce up to the edge of major roads, and then we complain that there's accidents on those roads. So it's something we really need to. This is not an easy topic, as you know. Well, we probably could talk all day about it, but it's something that we need to do in terms of our forestry design and mitigation measures to reduce accidents on roads. Because we just opened a beautiful new road, as you know, Tommy, from Cork to Kerry. If you haven't enough Cork people in Kerry already, but it's built through beautiful countryside, but it's also built through traditional deer habitat. And I think in the first couple of weeks there was 9 accidents on those roads, and there was no mitigation measures whatsoever. And obviously, we never want anybody to be involved in an accident, and in terms of fatalities or injuries or someone to lose their vehicle because of that. But, we have to take some responsibility in terms of mitigation measures that you would be common in other countries in the European Union as such. But definitely forestry design and our layout of forests is a significant challenge for us in terms of managing deer. If you have wall-to-wall Sika spruce with no open spaces, deer will only go one place, and that's onto the adjoining farmlands. And other than that, they're quite difficult to manage, as you would know yourself. I would say, Tommy, and maybe you've seen this yourself, is I think in recent years, like with the HCAP and, the various organisations providing training, and the same with the Irish Deer Commission, is one of our primary objectives is to promote best practice deer management. That's a very broad term, I know, but, it is one of our focuses. But I would say my own experience is that, more and more hunters now are very aware in terms of their responsibilities. There was a time where someone was maybe saying, I want to shoot a nice stag or a nice buck for the wall, or to say I have this trophy or something like that, which is, and obviously not taken away from the fact that trophies are a byproduct of good deer management, but it's really, I suppose, in terms of more and more hunters now are conscious in the sense of that we need to cull more females than males. This thing of, say, for example, where we're seeing in Scotland having a 12-month season for male deer, which is really being rejected by most deer managers and organisations. They're all obeying the traditional seasons for many reasons, including animal welfare. But it's really, I would say, the majority of hunters that I talk to now, there's very much a focus around, for example, those that are shooting for meat quality in terms of females, calves, as the best quality venison. But equally, I think there's a responsibility to say to people, look, I need to manage deer in my area. I have that responsibility. Now, I think in any sector of society, I'm not trying, Tommy, to try and paint deer hunters as in, that they all have halos above their heads and they do everything perfect. I think any sector of society, there's going to be a mixed bag in terms of knowledge and approach and so on, where some people think, I want to shoot a stag. But it's, it is important, predominantly, I would say as well, they are people, obviously, their livelihood is no more than it is for fishing and different things like that, where they bring clients or guests in to go fishing or clay pigeon shooting, but they are people that come in for deer stalking. And I know some people get hung up on that, but look, from my point of view, I would say it doesn't really matter what the address of the person is that's pulling the trigger. Once the trigger is pulled and the deer are managed, that's really, but for some people it is their livelihood. But, and obviously there is a focus in that industry on stags and bucks, but, increasingly, from people I would talk to the industry now, increasingly that they're seeing clients coming in specifically for females as well. They're not necessarily interested in those anchors.
What is, out of the whole consultations, IAS committee on the European level, what is the best outcome for Ireland and what would be the worst outcome for Ireland, just for people who would be, interested in taking part in the consultations?
If we take the negative first, in the sense of, if you have reclassification of Sika deer as an invasive alien species, and if you had the unlikely event that the derogation was not applied, what we would have is widespread animal welfare issues in terms of starving calves, male deer, in very poor condition, with no economic value being culled. We'd have the spread of deer, much faster, because it's coming at a time where we're really ramping up the number of trees that we're planting. So we're creating more and more habitat and corridors for deer to move. So that would be the worst outcome. The best outcome would be that the invasive alien species tag would apply to Denmark and Belgium, where there's been very, very recent introductions in the last 10, 15 years. And such a designation wouldn't apply to other countries. And there would be very much a focus on the work of what the National Deer Management Strategy Group is doing at the moment, in the sense of, how do we manage all deer species, not just Sika? How do we manage fallow? How do we manage red deer, both on state land, on private land? How do we manage them at a sustainable level that reduces their negative impact on the various land use sectors, such as farming, forestry, and the wider ecosystem?
There's one last issue that I discuss with all my guests from this podcast, and that is the issue of the restoration or introduction of predators to Ireland. Would that change the situation and help address the problems we've discussed today? To hear their responses, however, I refer you to an exclusive 3-part podcast series where you can listen to full interviews with my guests from this episode. The link is in the description of the show, so get in there and see what their opinions are about the introduction of predators like lynx or wolves, and whether that would help to control the growing numbers of Sika deer in Ireland. After speaking to my guests on this podcast and having countless conversations offline on this topic, what strikes me is that we are all talking about the same thing. There are just tiny differences in the how. I'm not going to suggest which option is better. I think that after listening to this episode, you are all well equipped to make your own mind. However, I want to finish with the opinion voiced in one of the previous episodes of the podcast, specifically episode 176 by Professor Adam T. Ford, who specializes in wildlife restoration ecology. His words seems to me like a guiding principle we should all apply while dealing on the policy level with problems like the ones we discussed in this episode.
Is less top-down or large-scale policies, and allow space for more local or decentralized decision-making. It's really about, how could we partition this policy so that it reflects the values of the people it affects the most?
That's it. Thanks for listening, and I hope you not only enjoyed this conversation, but also learned something from the side of an argument you might not have listened to otherwise.